Good, whatever time of day it is that you're joining me here today on Consequences of Communication podcast. My name is Tyler from editing, which I'm the same Tyler that's actually the host. I'm just doing this from editing today, and today it's a pretty special day here on Consequences of Communication podcast because this is the very first interview style podcast that I'm actually doing, and I'm doing it with my good friend Shawn. He happens to be my direct pastor at church. And then we have a lead pastor at church, which is above him, called Adam McCain. Both of them are going to be mentioned throughout the podcast. And I do apologize. I know the video is kind of shoddy, and there's actually going to be a still frame later on in the episode for the video component. Lessons learned. I didn't do the same setup that I normally do because I'm actually at his house and not mine to do this interview. But lessons learned. Take it away. As long as I don't repeat the same mistakes. Am I right? It's always life is always about improving, and that's what we are striving to do here on the Consequences of Communication podcast. So, without further ado, enjoy the podcast.
All right, good. Whatever time of day it is, you're joining us here today. I'm Tyler, the host of Consequences of Communication podcast. I'm here with a really good friend and mentor of mine, Shawn. He's actually my pastor. I do appreciate you joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, how are you doing today?
I am lovely.
Perfect. I do appreciate you taking the time out of the day to actually be on the podcast and me be able to interview you. I always love hearing your perspective on things. As we go through, I already have some questions outlined that are more than yes or no questions, or as I call it, the death by PowerPoint questions, the yes, no, maybe, undecided, rate from 1 to 5. All those tedious questions. And if I happen to ask something that you want clarification on or you want to expand on, please let me know, because I know words are hard.
Hence your podcast.
Right. And I want to make sure that there's as little miscommunication as possible. So the first question is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background of your life up to this point, your experiences and where you come from, just so the audience has a better understanding of.
Absolutely. So I grew up in rural Indiana, so the quintessential middle of nowhere. I had a father who was a Marine and a mother who was a pampered chef consultant. I probably inherited the majority of my personality from my mother, and then had a really complicated interaction with my father, and so, which I think is like most men. And I journeyed through trying to understand and knowing that my mom had zero issues making relationships. So never knew a stranger. My grandfather on that same side was the same way. So I grew up dynamically interacting with people socially and kind of just learning tools only because I had a mom who I could observe. And then I looked at my dad, and my dad was there. He was present. So I'm thankful for everything that he brought me from a stability standpoint. But we probably spoke 2 other languages. And so my dad consistently provided finances. He brought stability. He brought an awareness of justice. He taught me work ethic. But most of that work ethic was him telling me what I was doing wrong and asking me, why do you always do things the difficult way? And then there would be large swaths of time that I would just sit with him and work with him, and we wouldn't talk about anything. On the flip side, I've got my mom, we're singing and dancing around the house, we're throwing on albums together, we're laughing and making inside jokes, and there came a point in our friendship, my mother and I, that we kind of left my dad behind. And then I came down to Texas. I kind of left every single thing that I knew. I got that from my dad. My dad, when he was 18, rode across the country on his bicycle. So being independent, challenging authority, and being uncomfortable was kind of his MO. So I followed in that, moved down to Texas, and I'm sitting in a course at a local college, and the guy who's teaching it, i.e. our pastor, starts teaching us about the love languages. People go back and forth. Are they real? How much can we lean into it? I'm sitting there and they're going through the 5 different proverbial love languages. Acts of service, quality time, words of affirmation, physical touch, and gifts. I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, yeah, words of affirmation, that's me. Oh man, physical touch. I love giving people high fives. That's me. And then I realized in this class, like out of nowhere, my dad loves me. And what had happened was for decades, my dad was communicating love to me through quality time and acts of service. And I just didn't have the ability to translate that into affection. And so that made me realize, like, for every bit of masterful communication I had as an extrovert, I had a bunch of tools that I needed to gather. And that made me passionate about making sure that when I sit down with somebody, I try to learn who they are. In the different jobs that I've had, being socially dynamics helped as well. And there was a lot of natural things. I think in communication, like music, you have people who are natural musicians.
Right.
And then you've got people who are technical musicians. Somebody who learns how to use staff lines and how to use an instrument, they hit a point of, diminishing returns. But if you can take somebody who's naturally gifted in musicianship and teach them the basics of music, sky's the limit for them. And so I feel like socializing could be the same way.
Yeah, it's really great points. I do appreciate that. With the skill set that you have and the little bit of the dynamic that you have, what I've noticed with some other people, like the social butterflies, they have cast a wide net, but they don't have very deep relationships. Is that similar to what you have, or what you've experienced?
I actually had really deep relationships with a pretty core group of individuals. The gift and the curse of being an only child is that I didn't have siblings to lean on to. And so I've talked with this a couple other only children, is that the family dynamic that my wife has, where she has this built-in safety net of individuals who love her and will murder for her, because I know it, right? I never had that. And so I cherished friendships probably more than most. So I had a huge net of people from a networking standpoint, but I only had like 2 or 3 people that I claimed as friends. And if I called you my best friend, I meant it. I made a commitment to Tim Neff in 6th grade that I would be the best man in his wedding and he would be the best man in my wedding. And I got married at 33 and held to that commitment. That's how deep my ties were on that. So I will tell you though, as I've grown socially, it's been difficult to find people I can go deep with. Because what you'll find is, for lack of a better term, there's a social contract that we inadvertently do with every person we're connected with, where there's certain expectations on either side. When I walk into a room, generally most people rely on me to be the socially dynamic individual. But if I walk into the room with my pastor, nobody has any expectation out of me. Neither do I. And so often I found that in friendships, that if I'm not cautious, inadvertently, most of the people I end up getting involved with either are people that I glean from, so I get mentorship from them, or I mentor. It's difficult to find people who I can link arms with in a similar season.
Definitely can relate to that. I call the small group of friends having a seat at my table. Mm-hmm. It's the people that I trust to speak life into me, or like, hey, you're messing up, and I actually take them at value and contemplate what they say and really try to understand where they're coming from and what I'm actually doing wrong to try and correct myself, as opposed to hey, stranger, you're messing up with A, B, C, and D, and you're like, who are you? You don't know my life.
Yeah.
When the term consequences is said, what comes to your mind?
Usually consequences have a negative connotation to them. So that's the first thing that I think is, I've done something and I've reaped the reward of a negative behavior.
Yeah, I call it specifically with consequences, going to the principal's office. Because that's, you have to deal with these consequences. Oh, no, the principal.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why consequences is in the name of the podcast, is because the actual definition doesn't have the connotation. It's just a result of actions.
Yeah.
Is really what it is. And there's the really funny dynamic about it is there's consequences of communication is either too much communication, over communicating, not telling the truth, just not communicating at all. And it's not just verbal.
Yeah.
To you, what is the proper outlook to have to communicate effectively? Do you have a philosophy or statement in which about what it means for Shawn to communicate?
I think I'm at a point in my life that I'm becoming more and more aware of my weaknesses and trying to compensate and biased against those. So I was telling my wife the other day, who's probably been a social butterfly her whole life, but probably got told that she shouldn't be. So I've been navigating with her like, hey, if two individuals interact and both of you walk away saying, I'm weird, there was probably only one weird person in that interaction. And knowing my wife, she probably wasn't the weird one. She's really good at socializing. But unfortunately what will happen is that when two individuals walk into a social interaction and they both walk away thinking I'm weird, inadvertently you will take on shame from somebody else's actions. And so I've seen that in training individuals, because in the corporate world I've done that. I've seen that in personal relationships. And so I know my weakness is not being scared of socializing. And so I always try to think, and we've talked about this before, given a set of circumstances, if I'm 50-50, what am I more likely to be at weakness? Do I talk too much or talk too little? Tyler, I would ask what you think your weakness is, but you're hosting a podcast, so we won't go in that direction, right? But I know if I'm in a corporate event or at a meeting or even with a client, I think I have my mind's constantly racing. Ooh, that would be funny. That'd be funny to say. And so if I have to pause and say, like, ooh, should I say that? I probably shouldn't. So I try to compensate for that. I also try to think, how long have I been talking? Because if I've recognized that I might be talking too long, I probably have.
Yeah, pretty much very similar weaknesses of what you just mentioned for me. Like, a long time ago, like, I didn't really have a filter. I pretty much said, like, it comes to my mind straight out the door, and it was only with, I've talked about my best friend Chris on the podcast before, but he's in San Antonio now, and it was only hanging out with him and about actually putting a filter in place, which is really funny if you think about it, because if like you remember talking to him and some of the stuff that he would say, it's like, you don't have a filter, man.
Yeah.
He does not have a filter. So it's really
plank eye situation, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but it's also, I also believe that there's no bad examples. That there's just examples. There's examples of what to do and examples of what not to do. And in that instance, he became an example of what not to do. And I was like, I need to start not talking or stop talking. And then with the jokes too, my time in the military, I said something that could be like, I was kind of joking in a serious conversation about somebody, but I didn't really know my audience, because there was somebody up in the tower that was working that normally isn't up there. So I didn't really know. And I honestly completely forgot that she was there. And I said something. And immediately after I said it, I was like, dang it. There's somebody here. And sure enough, she said something. Like, as soon as I finished saying it, I started to think and she started to speak. And I was like, okay, let me think about what I did. Cool. Can I talk to you for a minute? So we go, like, step outside, and I apologize, and like, hey, sorry that this came across, and sorry that it was offensive. So to avoid those situations, should I say this? Should I not? Do I need to clean my filter? Do I need to change it? Do I need to add another one? Because there's
and just the value of like, I know plenty of individuals who, at the beginning of their relationship, I thought they were much more intelligent than they were. And half of it was just because they stayed quiet. And that goes two ways, right? But I think there's a level of respect for people who you can observe they have self-control, even in the ways that they communicate. And so inadvertently, you will show your cards to an individual if you don't know how to pump the brakes.
I'm pretty sure you know this better than I do, but obviously you and I are both Christians because you're my pastor.
Yeah.
I believe it's a proverb that, and there's several of these. It's like the fool is quick to anger, the fool is quick to speak, and the wise man is like better keep your mouth shut and be perceived as a wise man than prove them wrong by opening your mouth.
Yep.
And when I heard that, I was like, why are my skeletons in my closet out here for everybody to see? And it's just the conviction of the Holy Spirit, like, you need to change this. Okay, work in progress.
Yeah, but you've obviously not accidentally done. Because if I look over, I mean, obviously we've been in a relationship now for 5 years.
Pretty close to it.
Yeah.
I think 17.
Oh, so 7 years.
Yeah.
Very good.
But COVID happened, and that for me, it was April of 2020 for like 3 years.
Yeah.
And it was just horrible. Getting corrected that next year of, I have to actually like physically sign stuff and date it. Oh, it's not 20, it's not 21, it's not 22, it's 23.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we all had a little blip, right? So,
right.
But I look at the Tyler who I first met at a young adult service, who was super quiet in the back, which you duped me, right? And so very quiet, very observant, very like, I don't know if I like these people, into the, hey, I'm going to send 37 memes into our group chat, to now somebody who generally has something funny to add, but it's not too much.
Yeah. I appreciate that. It's definitely been a long work in progress, but going to your point, and one of the like stumbling issues, and I was actually leaving a church and kind of like it wasn't necessarily a bad situation from an outside perspective, but like my perception of it was like, this is horrible, like doom and gloom, like that a lot of people get like hurt by the people of the church, as opposed to, or their perception of the situation that happened, as opposed to actually being let down by God. Yeah. And then they're turning their perspective of, these people hurt me, so therefore God hurt me. Yeah. And in reality, that's not what happened. But going back to the like statement of communication, because really, like I'm pretty sure you know this for a fact, or remember this happening, but the communication is a key to every successful relationship, like sweeping across the nation in the late 90s, early 2000s. I don't know if I've told you this, but I've been thinking about that statement since I first heard it.
Okay.
And it was about the time I was a rebellious teenager, the father-son dynamic issues of, like, Tyler, why are you not getting good grades? I don't know. Like, perfectly, like, it's because I was being lazy, and I wasn't putting in the work, and I didn't want to because it wasn't challenging. Yeah. But instead of me saying that, I was just, I don't know. Yeah. I want this I want this conversation to end as fast as possible because I don't want to be yelled at by my dad or talked down to by my dad. So I changed it from communication to open communication, which means providing that longer answer. However, I could say, or could have said, no, they just didn't, or like somebody stole my bag with my homework in it. But that would be a lie. Yeah. So it developed into open, honest communication. Yeah. And over the years, I've added things and taken things away because other words make more sense. And it ended up being open, honest, loving, straightforward, clear communication is the key to every successful relationship. And that's kind of the statement that I try to live by. Because if you have all of those things when you're communicating with somebody, like, how can they hold anything against you? And you're a phenomenal example of this. When I'm like, hey man, I messed up. Like, one of the standards that we have being small group leaders or leaders in the church is not watching rated R movies. Well, I watched rated R movie. It was the Snyder Cut. And I was like, hey man, I messed up. And I'm thinking like, oh, you're going to yell at me and those past experiences are coming back. But you came from a very loving and understanding perspective of like, hey, Like, it's fine. Like, it messed up as long as it doesn't, like, as long as it's not a, I think you said as long as it's not a pattern or develops into a pattern. And that it doesn't develop into a need to watch those kind of movies or to go against the standards, not necessarily just the movies, but to go against the standards that were set before you. It's like, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And then we broke it down also of like getting the why behind it.
Right.
Because if we can identify the why, which is important, like when it comes to failures in communication, failures in relationship, like why is it that my dad was a poor communicator? Because his dad didn't teach him how to do it. And then his German dad didn't teach him how to do it, right? And so, and we use terms like generational curses, things like that, to kind of to allude to that. And I think there's both natural and supernatural things on that, but we allude to those things. But I want to know, like, if you knew that it was a rule and you chose to break it, what value system did you use to make that decision? And that's what we talked through, because ultimately, my job as a leader is not to punish or to rule, it's to lead. And so if I don't show you what healthy looks like, and number two, challenge you to make sure that you're taking the steps forward, then we start moving into, well, this is no longer leadership, this is dictating. And I'm not here to be anybody's parent. So, except Aaliyah, my daughter, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
And like, I think we've demonstrated on many occasions what my philosophy is about communication. And I know there's different kinds of communications. You kind of touched on it a little bit earlier when you're like, hey, you got mentors, mentees, but there's not a lot of people to link arms with in the same season that you're in. How does communication differ between those levels with you? Or does it differ?
Yeah, so when I'm communicating to somebody who I am taking responsibility for, when I'm saying something, I'm trying to figure out what weaknesses am I aware of? What is the state of the individual in front of me? So I'm going to be real cautious in the way that I blindly dictate something if I don't think you're going to receive it. So if you come to me and you say, this is dumb and my job is to really nudge you towards healthy. If you come to me and say, I want advice, well, then I have to figure out, do you really want advice, or do you want me to say something that you want to hear? But if you truly come with inquiry, then I'm trying to say, how can I communicate this in a way that translates best to Tyler, or best to David, or best to John, or anybody else that we're in relationship? When I communicate to somebody who's I've decided that I respect their opinion, then I need to pause and be careful in the way that I communicate, and I probably need to pump the brakes on most of my opinions. I say that because if I'm truly inquiring and not doing what people try to do to me, where it's like I'm going to ask a question so I can get an answer so that I can qualify whatever my perspective is, I want to remove that from myself because, again, I know my weakness. I'm deeply opinionated. I'm a strong communicator, and I convince a lot of people, even people who I trust and respect. And if I trust and respect them, it means that I really need to actually ask them the questions. And then in peer-to-peer, I think there's a bit of an ebb and flow. Most anybody you're in a relationship with, the reason you're in a relationship with them is because, for one, you probably have similar complaints because you're in a similar lifestyle, you're in a similar life season. But there's a good chance that you're strong in certain areas that they're weak in, and you're weak in areas that they're strong, and there's a reciprocation that comes into play. So making sure that I don't force myself into mentor or mentee by trying to strong arm them with my weaknesses, or trying to be passive in the things that I'm strong in. I think those are kind of how I'd level those three lanes out.
Yeah. So as you were talking about the pier, I was thinking about like you're covering somebody's strength is the phalanx formation from 300 is you're holding the shield and it covers half of your body or half the shield covers half of your body and the other half of the shield covers your your comrade and then the person to your right they're responsible for covering your half of your body with half of their shield as you have a free hand to attack with.
Yeah.
And I'm like that. To me, that's a perfect example of that, like a visual example.
Steal that for my next sermon.
Right? So we stole it from a graphic novel to turn it into a movie, to turn it into really good tactics. So the next question I got for you is, how has your communication changed over the years? What caused it to change? And is it something that you think about actively changing of like, kind of like what we were talking about earlier with, should I say this joke and implementing that pause?
Yeah, it's certainly changed, obviously drastically. When I look back, the reason I can mentor you in pumping the brakes is because I had to learn how to pump the brakes myself. I mean, typically, most leaders in your life, they had a weakness that was similar to yours and they figured out how to fix it. Or they had somebody in their life who taught them really well at a young age what tools to use. But I was known as an individual who was constantly on, always talking, always energetic. And I had a manager who looked at me, and this was probably about 3 years ago. She said, for one, the more you talk on a subject, typically, the less you know about it. So when you start filling space with your words, it's usually to mask something that you're not knowledgeable in. So that's one point. And then she was quoted by saying this: you need to be brief, be brilliant, and then be gone. Because if you can succinctly say something that's truthful, it usually has more impact than if you communicate a novel.
That is very interesting. The only thing I could think of, or a similarity I could think of is, I can't remember what specific parable that Jesus said. I think it might have been maybe the unleavened bread or the seeds that were walking, and then his disciples pulled him aside and was like, "Hey, what did that mean?" Mm-hmm. I just can't remember that story, but that's kind of the same thing, right? Of Jesus dropping knowledge bombs and then explaining it later.
Mm-hmm. I think there are two occasions for that, but the primary one that comes to mind is when he's scattering the seeds.
Yeah, like we all get frustrated, we all get mad and upset. But so when you're frustrated, when you're to that boiling point where, like, the words that you want to say or the words that describe the situation from your perspective or what you're trying to get across just completely go away, what do you do to correct yourself or to like calm down or change your perspective?
It depends upon how much rest I have. So I communicated to my wife recently that because I've made a shift in my job, I have a lot more margin. I have a lot more wiggle room. So the more rest I have, and the better sleep that I have, the better mental space because of what I'm pouring into or pulling from, the more flexibility I have to be able to really consider it. So when I'm unhealthy in areas of rest, or just capacity, I usually default to deep sarcasm, and it's not great. I had a group of employees who said, "You are sometimes the meanest person we know, but the customer you're talking to doesn't know it, but we know," right? And the problem is that reinforces behaviors, and so I don't qualify that, but I just know that's where it is.
Yeah.
If I'm particularly frustrated with something, my wife and I have had what you would call complex conversations, right? That's but other people call them arguments. I've had plenty of times I've said, I'll say it out loud, I'm pausing right now, not because I have nothing to say, because I know I can never take back what I will say. And so I think that's been a good break for me to make sure that I don't have regrets. Because, again, as the adage says, you don't regret the thing that you don't say, usually, right? But I have plenty of things that I've deeply hurt people. And if I think about the heart of hearts, because people say, "Oh man, that's who you really are," I don't think that's true. I'm probably the most me when I'm healthy and well rested, and I get to be the best version of myself. And unfortunately, in really stressful situations, I probably show my greatest weaknesses. And if I can save my future self from regret, I think that's worthwhile.
I think that's a great thing. I've talked about this on a previous podcast. I don't remember what episode it was, but it was talking about whenever you're in an argument or whatever, it'd be like, hey, as a guideline, what you have to explain before things get heated and not in an argumentative state of like, okay, so when you're working on the dynamics of the relationship or the logistics of the relationship, like, hey, so if I ever say I need a break for something, you need to respect that, because if you keep pressing me, I'm probably going to end up saying something that I'm going to regret and it's going to hurt you. And like, that's pretty much what you said.
Absolutely.
Just completely different words.
Yeah, I agree.
As normal. We just talked about you being frustrated in what you do to bowling point, getting away, making sure there's an establishment or an established guideline for if you or your wife or whoever you're talking to or whatever the situation is of, hey, I need a break, give me like 10, 15 minutes. Do you have an established time or about that of, hey, like you're taking a break, or hey, just give me a couple minutes as you process things to your head? Or is that like, hey, I'm going to go decompress by doing something completely different in another room by myself for a certain amount of time?
Let me qualify the statement that I gave earlier, because I know most people process like you were saying, where they need to step away, they need that break. I think that if you're that type of individual who needs that, you should set a reasonable time boundary for yourself. I'm a fast processor, so typically I really need about 30 seconds, and I'm usually calculated on what I'm saying. I know, like when I get cut off in traffic, I will get angry, realize that I probably just did it to somebody else, and I will talk myself out of being frustrated with the person who just cut me off. So that's just my MO. It's how I operate. I am, though, pausing when I can assess the person in front of me doesn't process those emotions the same way I do. And I try to repeat what I hear them saying. And that's something Pastor Adam has taught. Like, hey, do you mind if I reiterate what I thought I heard you say? I thought I heard you say this, 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 and this. Is that correct? Yes or no? And if they say yes, then I say, hey, well, let me just say, well, I mean, we had an argument like 3-4 days ago, and we'll walk through this. Let me just say, what you felt there was real, given the set of circumstances. It's not what I meant to do. And if I hurt you from that, that was not my intention. Now let's navigate like what I was trying to do. And so I try to repeat as much and really just acknowledge the fact that most people want to communicate well, and either given a lack of a toolbox or a lack of, as we talked about earlier, margin. If they don't have either of those, or neither of them, there's a good chance that I need to pull tools out of my toolbox and hand it to them.
You described something that I meant to say earlier, like towards the beginning, because I think this was the second or third episode that I recorded that talked about the flow of communication. And, you know, it's a logistical piece, kind of like what you were saying that Pastor Adam, which is our church pastor, talked about, is to really understand things, because you have your own worldview. which means you see situations through your own perspective. I see things through my own perspective. What my parents actually gave this example before. Like, my dad says the sky is blue, and my mom's like, is that violet? Is that, like, and getting to like the real nitty gritty, like 3,000 different colors of blue there are. It's like, no, the sky is blue. And what that kind of demonstrates is somebody says something, the person responding is like, let me make sure I understand you. And is this what you meant? No, I meant this. And then you clarify so that we're all in understanding of what the real issue or topic is that we're talking about.
Well, and even more so, like, some of the best arguments that my wife and I have had are arguments over what I communicated her feelings were when they weren't, that wasn't what she was feeling. And through that, like, I've realized I'm probably not as in tune or don't have near as much of a developed palate for my own emotions as my wife does. So I know that for me, frustrated, angry, and furious are just little angry, medium angry, big angry. Like, I don't, there's no nuance in it. Like, there's even sad is like, that's still angry, right? Like that, those are, I really don't have a lot of, to use your analogy earlier, I don't have multiple shades of blue in my crayon box. I just have blue, and it's kind of broken because I'm colorblind, right? And so, like, that's kind of where it's at.
So with the communicating and the current process that you have with it, how is that different now from 10 years ago?
I just think I have more tools to pull from. And probably not even 10 years ago. I mean, our pastor, Adam McCain, is a masterful communicator. And so I've been in a relationship at our local church now for 17 years. So it's easier for me to look out at, because at this point, like, the number of tools that I've added to the proverbial box is not too many in the past 10 years. I've just gotten better at using them. But I think I look at how I communicated back in like 2007 versus 2024, and there are light years difference. And I just think about, it's like the first time you get a house. Like, well, I went to IKEA. I have a drill, that should work, right? And then you realize it's not a real drill, right?
Yeah,
so
like 3 hours later, and it's like, this looks nothing like the picture.
Absolutely. Now,
why is this thing destroyed?
Now I've got a Makita with like 16 different batteries, and I've got all these other things. Now I qualify tools that I don't need, right? So, so I think that's kind of the transition I've made along the years.
I always think it's good to not look back at your life and be like, with regret, or with the intent of looking back and getting the feelings of regret, but looking back at your life and with the intention of, that's where I was, and I've made all of this progress, so I am doing so much better. And I think that's good to think about, because it's also a good trajectory of your life in the future. Because if you're, and I know you're really future oriented, you plan things out, at least goals that you want to reach, and like by next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 probably, even further than that.
No, not quite further.
I have the way I've looked at it is, where do I actually got this from Alex Hermosi, where he has conversations with his like 80-year-old self, and it's more of like a check and balance kind of thing of, this is where I imagine my 80-year-old self to be. What advice would that individual give me now in order to get to that point? Okay, well, he's not going to give me, okay, you're 79, I did this, you're 78, I did this, on this day this happened. It's no more big lessons like, hey, what you can do now, start taking steps A, B, and C to prepare you for steps that you need to take a year from now, which is DEF, and then so on and so forth. Is that also kind of how you plan out your life, or what's your mechanism for doing that?
Yeah, I wish I was intelligent enough to do that. I'm probably not. I try to know where I'd like my life to be principally. So I principally, I don't want to be ruled by material goods. So I want to make sure that I'm cautious with the appetites I take on. So I try to keep that. So I'm more in the midst of a information generation. I'm looking less for quotes and snippets, and I'm looking for overarching principles. I'm trying to dig into. You mentioned Proverbs earlier. I'm trying to understand what real wisdom is so that I can apply it. And so the more I get the appropriate lenses to view through, I think that would get me. That's how I try to approach, because I can't imagine 80-year-old self. It's really hard for me to imagine mid-50s self. So if I had to imagine who I probably know I look like, I could probably have a conversation with 5 to 10 years Shawn from now. That's if I'm going to be at least a good self-assessment.
Okay, and that's good. I always like the self-analysis.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think everything really kind of starts, is making sure that you're able to accurately self-analyze.
Mm-hmm.
But then having the people that sit at your table of, okay, so I've analyzed myself as this. Is this correct?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that also what you see in my life or see for my life? And getting that kind of like backboard
Yeah.
situation or conversation going, because 5-10 years from now, like, I still have friends. Like,
Yeah.
I still have those people in my life. Hopefully, that's always the goal.
Yeah. Well, no, and you had a point that I didn't even bring up. I've got people in my life who I've not just told them I want feedback. I've allowed them the space to give me feedback, and they've been able to hand me necessary truths about myself, because blind spots are definitionally blind.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you bring up a great point of, if you try to develop self in isolation, you're probably not going to be successful.
I would say that that's true. Although I also think that not complete isolation, but some isolation is important in some, for lack of a better term, and I hate this, but season of life. I always hate using that, 'cause I don't know why. I think it's overused probably. But like the last couple years, I've been pretty much isolating myself from a lot of different things. And as you know, I haven't completely isolated myself from my family, but I've severely limited that because of the difference in mindset that my parents have and what I have and where I'm trying to get to.
Well, I would push back a little bit. You use the term isolation to describe boundaries. And I think boundaries are different than isolation. Isolation is the shutting off of all voices, both good and bad. And I've not seen you do that in the past couple of years. What you've done is you've been more intentional of shutting down individuals who have overstepped the boundaries that you've set. And you've found new individuals that you can add to, your proverbial table to speak into your life. So for the past 3 to 5 years, people who are walking up to your table and talking to you, you've made them sit outside the restaurant, right? But you've invited people like me in, Chris, and the different Chris, right? Chris from our church.
Yeah.
So
I know lots of Chris's.
Yeah, it's a great name. It's my dad's name. So you've not isolated at all. You've just been intentional with who you allow in certain spaces. And we talked about this principally years ago, and this is not my quote, but we talked about the analogy of the temple. And that for the Jew, like during Jesus' time, there were 3 layers to that temple. You had the outer court, you had the inner court, and you had the Holy of Holies. The outer court was where Gentiles could go. There was a lot of selling and exchanging. The inner court was Jews only, and the Holy of Holies is going to be the place where only the high priest can go, once per year. And so you can model the relational connection you have with individuals to say like, hey, there are plenty of people that widen that you mentioned earlier that can be in your outer court. Your inner court should be people that you have deep community with, but don't necessarily allow them to have holy access, right? There should be a very short list of individuals who can get access to your Holy of Holies. If you take that analogy one step further, most of the people that you've been hurt by in your life, not all of them, but most, are probably individuals who you allowed into holy places and they dishonored that because, again, culturally, they just didn't know better. And so if you can navigate your relationships that way, it helps you protect other people from dishonor. And then number two, it helps you from any sort of, we like throwing out trauma out there. So,
Right. With communication being such kind of like a focal point just throughout life, because how do we live life together without communicating? Mm-hmm. Is there a time where you feel like is a communication failure on your part that ended up changing how you look at communication or your approach to communication? And what were the changes, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I like to try to self-reflect on most failures because, frankly, I wish I was good enough at just taking my wins and learning from those. It's usually my losses that help me learn the most. And so my favorite example of that is I used to work in the banking sector, and that was right near when the Patriot Act came through. And Tyler, this is going to be a revelation to you, but I happen to be a Caucasian male.
What?
Yeah, revelation. And so...
Not Anglo-Saxon?
Right. And so when I would ask somebody about their citizenship, it's a lot of pain. They think I suddenly put on a red hat, right? And so it was during that same time. And so actually I learned for every angry client that I had, there were a host of questions that I had to ask. Are you a U.S. citizen? Have you ever served in the U.S. military? Will you allow us to do a banking and credit check? And so but the first question was, are you a U.S. citizen? I had so many people angry at me, and I'm like, oh, I can get better at the fact that these people are angry at me, or I can think creatively. And I just flipped it around. And for some reason, when I ask people, have you ever served in the U.S. military? Are you a U.S. citizen? I never offended a person again, and I never had to navigate that. And so I try to do the same thing for most of those failures. This was over a decade ago. I love banter. That's why you and I get along well.
That's one of my favorite words.
Right. And so I had somebody I drove up to Michigan to go for a wedding, group of friends. We're having a blast. And there was a girl who self-described herself as deeply sarcastic and communicated, for lack of a better term, that she loved picking back and forth. Well, I grew up fat and unpopular, so I've been gifted in that space. And so she'd say something, and I just shut her down. And then she'd say something again, and it was just, I'm finessing this conversation. And I'm having a blast. Like, I'm having such a good time. And got to the end of the night, and we were all going to go to a concert together. And I knew this particular person that they really liked that. And they told their friends, no, if that guy's going to go, I'm not going to go. I hate that guy. And it's like I think most people, it should take them a while before they hate you, right? If you know me long enough, I'm going to irritate you, right? But
right.
And that was kind of a defining moment where I thought to myself, what do I want to be known as? Do I want to be known as the individual who's really good at making a good comeback and joking with people? Or do I want to be known as, we have somebody who goes to our church named Donna Hart. Every time Donna walks in the room and talks with me, I feel like I can conquer the world. And I said, so on the spectrum of where I want to be and what I provide to people with my communication, I want to be known as somebody who, when you sit down with them, you walk away and say, I have more life. And so I think that moment probably was one of the most defining failures and then learning moments.
I really do appreciate it. It's also a different, like a unique introspective, or I think that's the right term, introspective analysis, because sometimes it takes basically what I think how God corrects us the majority of the time is, hey, you shouldn't do that. Hey, you shouldn't do that. Hey, I told you not to do that. And then just like a freight train comes and wrecks you because you did it too many times, because you're not getting the point. And I think a lot of people are like that don't self-reflect and don't self-analyze or self-reflect, that they need a situation like that. Because I don't remember an exact situation like that made me start doing that. It was just little situations over time. I'm like, when I was in Abilene, when I first met my best friend Chris, not the Chris from church, like I was a planner at that time, like planner. I want to plan out my month in advance of like, I'm on rotating shifts, so every other Friday I can go dancing with everybody else. So we just went dancing this last Friday. So a week and a half from now, and like created a Facebook event, invited people that were part of the group. Nobody showed up, and I got tired of it and like really frustrated with it. And then Chris would be like, okay, it's Friday night. We normally meet up at 6. It's 4:30, 4:45. Anyone want to go dancing? Everybody shows up. And then after a while, it's like everybody just left. That's weird. Talked to Chris about it, and some people were like, they don't like how I talk about things or how blunt I was, because I was not tactful at all. There was no filter in place yet. And it was through that where I started to actually implement that filter and start to analyze and start to actually try to work on myself, however little, like baby steps at a time it is. But what like on the flip side of that, what is there a moment where you were like maybe struggling for like an interview, or like going into an interview where you were nervous and like you like prepped for it, that you actually ended up succeeding in that conversation of like, hey, this worked here. It was the first time I did this. I'm gonna start incorporating this in my tool belt.
Yeah, I mean, especially in the field that I work in now, I interact with a lot of individuals and I talk about their finances. And so I constantly, so I work with a group of bankers too. And so I ask them for feedback. Hey, I know I'm still, in this role, but I don't have everything together. Anything you would change about that? I don't ask them if I did good or bad, because I know I probably did great. So I don't need feedback on whether or not I'm good or bad. I need to figure out, would you change anything? And if you would change anything, what would you change? And then if they say that, I really take it to heart and I try it. Now, if they come from outside, I'm like, well, that was a good dumb recommendation. I'm not going to do it.
But bring donuts in every morning.
But I'll try to also reinterpret what they're saying. Like, that's a dumb recommendation, but I wonder if they mean this. And I've seen that be wildly successful. I think humility pays off. If you're willing to humble yourself and know that, man, it's not whether or not I think I have it together. I know I don't have it all together. And if I'm willing to humble myself to the process, I'll save myself a lot of those train moments. And I'd prefer nudges over trains any day.
Same, but there's definitely some stuff. I mean, you know me, I'm a little bit stubborn when it comes to some things where it's like, okay, nudge a little bit harder, shove, and then just escalates from there until the train hits. About failures and humbling yourself and making sure that you stay humble. That kind of topic always reminds me of Thomas Edison when he's inventing the light bulb, where he finally invents the light bulb after like 3,000 or whatever experiments, and he finally gets it, and they're like, "Oh, this is so great! You finally created you you finally learned how to create a light bulb after so many failed experiments, which is typically how we as a society look at that. But he's like, no, I didn't fail that many times. I figured it out. That's how many times, like, that's not the way to make a light bulb. And I think that's pretty important. He kind of stayed humble, as far as I know, he stayed humble in that he didn't consider those just complete failures and took nothing away from that except don't do that again. Especially the way that his outlook is. I'm positive he learned from those mistakes, and he kept that with him of maybe for future invention or whatever the case may be. And that's really what I think communication overall is. Like, there's things are going to change regardless from here on in the future. Like 10 years ago, nobody heard of the Black Lives Matter movement, but as an example. And then now, because of that movement, there's certain cultural things that are now shunned or looked down upon, and then there's other things that are exemplified. So that changes how we all have to communicate.
Yeah.
And I know we as a church went through that.
Yeah, my goodness. I'd like to highlight something, though, because we've had this interaction before as well. We'll talk about, like, hey, Shawn, I'm struggling with sin. And I'd always ask you, like, are you struggling or are you sinning? Like, those are two different things, right? Like, if you're struggling, there's no shame for struggle. If you're sinning, well, then let's walk through repentance. Let's talk through it. I think failure is the same way. I think it's really, really easy for me to say, it's not a failure, it's a win, and this is why it's a win. As opposed to, like, if something didn't go well, then I know I need to own the part where I didn't produce a positive result. Now, we can figure out weighting and percentages, like, I'm at 10% at fault versus 100% at fault, right? Like, I need to know where I fall in that spectrum, but the more you're willing to, again, humble yourself and say, man, I really messed that up. That's what gives you the platform to be able to learn and then apply. And if you push people away or push self-reflection away, you'll continue to repeat bad behaviors, and you'll callous yourself to feedback, and number two, you'll hate the rest of the people around you, and they won't like you either.
I completely agree. And I'm pretty sure you haven't listened to every episode or any, but throughout you've actually touched on stuff that I've said or that other episodes have covered.
Beautiful.
And it's fantastic. But that's all I have for you. Again, I appreciate your time, and thanks for tuning in.
Hello, this is Tyler from editing. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of Consequences of Communication. I do appreciate the time that you've taken out of your busy day and busy schedule to listen to this podcast. This is the first interview podcast that I've done. If you've liked this and you think somebody else that you know and care about is going to get value out of this, I would greatly appreciate if you share this with them. Leave a comment, subscribe. Y'all know the drill. And join us next week for Consequences of Communication, episode 15 on April 16th, 4 p.m., about 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. And until then, catch you later, take care, and enjoy life.